Hello, everyone, and welcome back after our lunch break. It's good to see everyone, and let's get right to it. We're going to start with our third speaker and third session today. I'm looking very much forward to it. Before we begin, just a quick reminder, the questions have been fantastic. We really appreciate that. Brings a lot of dynamics and interesting discussions for our speakers. So if we can just blend in again, if you'd like to do our questions, please keep them coming, either through the QR code or in our Q&A box in our session there. That'd be fantastic. Good, then it is my pleasure to introduce our third speaker and our third topic. Today, we'll be talking about the new copyright exception for text and data mining for scientific research purposes, a Pyrrhic victory for open science, ? Speaker is Dr. Paweł Kamocki. Dr. Kamocki, are you there?
Yes, I read you loud and clear.
Fantastic. When we're discussing it, we take away the titles, we go by first name basis. Is that okay, Paweł?
By all means.
Fantastic. And can I ask, where are you physically sitting now? What city are you in?
Actually, I'm in Paris, France.
Okay, excellent. May I ask, how's the weather in Paris? Here in northern Germany, the sun is shining?
It is reasonably sunny, albeit quite cold.
Right, cold. Okay. Well, at least it's not raining, and it's good that you can join us from Paris. Welcome. I'd like to quickly introduce you before we get started. Paweł is a legal expert in Leibniz-Institute for Deutsche Sprache, Mannheim. In 2017, he obtained his doctorate in law from the universities of Paris, where he currently is, and Münster for a thesis on legal aspects of data-intensive university research, with a focus on knowledge commons. An active member of the Clarin community since 2012, he currently chairs the Clarin Legal and Ethical Issues Committee, Clarin being the Common Language Resources and Technology Infrastructure. One of his main research interests deal with legal issues in machine translation. Today, he will present the content of the new TDM exception for scientific research in the EU, TDM being text and data mining. Also discuss its potentially negative impact on open science and suggest institutional strategies to prevent it from materializing. It is a great pleasure to welcome Dr. Paweł Kamocki to our third session today. And we'll give you a virtual welcome. And Paweł, the digital stage is yours.
Thank you kindly, David, for this nice introduction. So without further ado, I will provide a quick overview of my presentation. So I'll start with the context. I'll present very briefly the copyright framework in the European Union and the events that led to the adoption of the new copyright exception for text and data mining for scientific research purposes. Then I'll try to unpack this exception for you. We'll go through all the legalese, and I hope I'll make it clearer for you what this exception really means as it is adopted in the directive. And then at the very end of my presentation, I'll try to provide some commentary, and we'll see together if this exception is really a victory for open science, if it's good for open science. And we'll try to discuss how the open science community can actually make the best of it. So let me start with the context. For those of you who are not fully familiar with copyright law in the European Union, in discussing text and data mining, copyright in text and data mining, it is important to know that in copyright law worldwide, there is an axiom called the idea-expression dichotomy, or the idea-fact dichotomy. It means that pure information, such as facts or ideas, is not protected by copyright, only its expression is protected. So everyone can extract information from a scientific paper as long as, and this is not the copyright relevant act, as long as the elements of expression, that is the actual text of the paper, is not reproduced. So ideas are free, facts are free, they are not protected by copyright. And this, I think, should be a foundation on which the discussion on text and data mining exceptions should be based. In the European Union, copyright law is harmonized. That is, copyright law provisions are more or less the same across the European member states, the EU member states. This harmonization has been accomplished by a text called the Directive on Copyright in the Information Society in 2001. And this text adopted an approach in which the exclusive rights of authors are defined very broadly. The main rights that are relevant for our presentation here are the right of reproduction and the right of communication to the public. So these rights, these are the exclusive rights of authors, which means that only the authors can accomplish them, or if someone else wants to perform such acts, he or she needs permission from the author, normally. And especially the right of reproduction is defined very, very broadly. It's really any reproduction in whole or in part, by any means and in any form. And to counterbalance these very broadly defined exclusive rights, the European legislator has adopted a series of narrowly defined exceptions, most of which are in fact optional. So the member states may or may not implement them. There are very many of them, of these exceptions. There is a special exception that actually allows us to browse the internet, because this would not, normally it is a copyright relevant act because you make reproductions on your screen. And there is a special exception that actually enables internet browsing. There is also an exception for non-commercial scientific research. There is an exception for citation parody, etc. It is also important to keep in mind that in the European Union, the threshold of originality is particularly low. What it means in practice, it's that it is very easy for a work to be protected by copyright, to meet the criteria for copyright protection. So almost any human creation is in fact protected by copyright. And the Court of Justice of the European Union has a tendency to interpret copyright extensively. For example, that is in favor of copyright protection. For example, recently it has been decided that copyright exceptions cannot be based directly on fundamental rights, constitutional rights. So just the fact that there is a constitutional right, for instance, to the right of freedom of research, is not enough to justify a copyright exception for this purpose. So really only the exceptions listed in European law are the valid exceptions to copyright. And since like many lawyers, I'm a person who loves art and beautiful things. I made a drawing for you to really represent how the copyright landscape looks in the European Union versus the US. So in the US, we have something that we can describe as an endless ocean of copyright. That is, everything that is not on a little island of a copyright exception is under copyright. Whereas in the United States, we have a much more balanced, so to say, approach. It really consists of balancing the rights of authors in having their creations protected and the rights of the public. And this is accomplished via an open norm rather than a closed list of exceptions. And this open norm in the United States specifically is called fair use. But the approach in the European Union is quite fundamentally different. And this is important to keep in mind for our discussion here. I'm sorry. All right. So the problem with text and data mining when it comes to copyright is that text and data mining, just like any digital use really, necessarily entails acts of reproduction, that is copying. In order to mine data, you need to make reproductions of the data in your computer's memory. And the research exceptions that exist in the European Union have proven insufficient to cover text and data mining because their national transpositions are usually very narrow, and also they actually only allow non-commercial research, which is not satisfying for the research community. So the conundrum that the European legislator had to solve was really how to enable researchers to do data mining legally. And there are basically three solutions. Either we oblige researchers to obtain licenses from the authors or the publishers, the right holders, for text and data mining. So we oblige them to really have a permission to mine every paper that they want to mine. This option has been explored in the stakeholders dialogue entitled Licenses for Europe, which was a total fiasco because the research community took a very firm position saying that they're not interested in paying for text and data mining. They insisted that the right to read should be the right to mine. Everything that the researcher has the right to read, he or she should also have the right to analyze digitally, that is, to mine. So the second option was a dedicated copyright exception, and this was the option that has gained more and more traction gradually. Specific exceptions for text and data mining for research purposes were adopted in the UK in 2014, in France in 2016, and in Germany in 2017. But necessarily, these were limited to non-commercial research because the previous directive on copyright in the information society only allowed exceptions for non-commercial research. So these exceptions were still not fully satisfying for the research community. The third option would be to really redefine the European copyright framework, for example, by changing the definition of exclusive rights, narrowing down the definition of the reproduction right, or introducing an open norm. But this option is legal fiction, really. It's not on the table. We've gone too far this exceptionalism, as some authors call it, path. So we are stuck to this landscape with narrowly defined exceptions. I'm sorry. So what has finally happened is that the directive on copyright in the digital single market was first proposed in 2016 and then finally adopted in 2019. And this landmark text that has the ambition of reforming copyright and adapting it to the digital economy contains not one but two exceptions for text and data mining. One is specifically for text and data mining for scientific research purposes. The other has a more general scope, but here we'll only focus on Article 3, that is only on the exception for text and data mining for scientific research purposes. The deadline for transposition of this directive, because let me remind you that EU directives do not apply directly in the member states, they need to be transposed. That is, national laws have to be adopted that translate the language of the directive into the national law. So the deadline for transposition was actually in June last year. So by now, most countries should have adopted national text and data mining exceptions. I'm terribly sorry, my throat is not doing very well. I'll drink some more water. Terribly sorry for that. So let me move on now and unpack, as I promised, the content of the text and data mining exception in this new directive. So text and data mining in the directive is defined very, very broadly, actually, it's a much broader definition than commonly adopted in the scientific community, and it covers any automated analysis, any automated technique aimed at analyzing data to generate or extract information, patterns, trends, etc. So it covers all sorts of machine learning, artificial intelligence, and all this sort of research that involves automated analysis of digital data. Now, who are the beneficiaries of the exception? Because this exception has a limited list of beneficiaries. It's not for everyone. It is actually only for research institutions and cultural heritage institutions. So the definition of a research institution is quite elaborate to cover all the specificities of all the EU member states. In some of them, universities are generally public. In others, there is a large part of private universities. So the definition is quite complex, but it really boils down to covering all universities and all public research institutions. Public-private partnerships are expressly included. So a university or a research institute that participates in a public-private partnership project can still use the exception. And another group of beneficiaries that we will not discuss in detail here are the cultural heritage institutions like libraries, museums, and archives. Now, what is really permitted by this exception? So what can be done without permission from the right holders? It's a reproduction, the act of copying of copyright protected material. And as I mentioned, almost everything is copyright protected, almost any text. It has been ruled by the Court of Justice of the European Union that a string as short as 11 consecutive words can be protected by copyright. So now, for the sole purpose of text and data mining for scientific research purposes, research institutions can make copies of protected material. It's only for the purpose of text and data mining that there's no close reading possible. It has to be only for digital analysis and only for scientific research. So other uses, like, for example, making decisions regarding scientific careers, promotion, this exception cannot be used for this sort of automated decision-making. It's only for scientific research, really. An important condition on this exception is lawful access to the material. That is, the institution, not an individual researcher, the institution needs to have a license or a subscription to actually read the article legally, or this article has to be available, or article or any sort of data, really, any data set. It can be numbers, videos, all sorts of data are covered. Or this is available on the open internet, for example, via YouTube, etc. So it really embodies the principle that the research organizations insisted on, that the right to read is the right to mine. Whatever researcher has the right to read, he or she has now the right to mine. So in the process of data mining, copies are being made. In my community, in natural language processing, these copies are generally referred to as corpora, that is, collections of data that are analyzed in order to extract information. And so these copies can be stored, they can be kept by the university, they can be reused for research purposes, including for verification of results, but they need to be stored with an appropriate level of security. The result of the text and data mining, the output, for example, a trained language model in my community, in natural language processing, is generally copyright free, so it can be shared freely. However, the copies, the corpora, cannot normally be shared because the exception allows no communication to the public. It's only for reproduction, really. Some technicalities about this exception include the fact that it's overridden. It overrides contracts, and this is very important because digital content is normally accessed through a contract, terms of service, for example, on the internet, or a contract with a publisher that grants a university access to a database. There are terms of use as well. So normally these terms of use could simply state that text and data mining is not allowed. And under this exception, such a clause would be null and void. It wouldn't apply because the exception overrides contracts, which is not normally the case with other exceptions. So this is a very special exception. It has the power to override contractual clauses, which is very, very important and very beneficial for science. However, right holders, publishers, for example, are allowed to apply measures that are necessary to ensure the security and integrity of the networks or databases. Researchers, on the other hand, can override these technological protection measures, but there is a special legal procedure for requesting access to content that is behind technological protection measures. But this procedure is cumbersome and very rarely used in practice. So I'll comment on this later, but this is an important aspect of this exception and can really turn into a sort of cat and mouse game or a sort of a digital arm race. Who has better, technological measures? Are publishers better at implementing security measures, or are the researchers better at actually circumventing these measures? So in order to clarify the situations, member states should encourage the adoption of best practices regarding these technological protection measures, as well as the rules regarding secure storage of the copies made in the process. It is important to remember that this exception can actually be mixed with the existing exception for non-commercial research, and this is what has been done in Germany. Now, let me very briefly have a look at the national transpositions in two EU member states, that is Germany and France. So Germany took a very bold decision to actually mix this exception with this text and data mining exception for scientific research with the general exception for non-commercial scientific research. And so the German legislator was able to allow citizen scientists to benefit from this exception as long as they pursue non-commercial purposes. But that is kind of common sense. A citizen scientist, a scientist that is not affiliated with a research organization, normally pursues non-commercial purposes. Germany has also allowed sharing of the copies, the corpora that I mentioned, but only with a limited circle of persons for joint scientific research. And this sharing must stop upon completion of the project. The corpora can also be shared with individual persons for verification of results, but sharing can only be done by non-commercial institutions, which is not a big problem because, well, German universities are by definition non-commercial institutions. Whereas the French legislator did not mix this exception with the general exception for non-commercial research. So these two aspects of the exception are not allowed in France. So once again, we will have important differences between the member states, which kind of defies the purpose of European harmonization, if you ask me. So just very briefly, let me comment on some friction points in this new exception. So it is an exception, which means that it proves the rule that text and data mining that is not covered by the exception needs authorization from the right holder. I can develop on this later because I think my time is short. Another problem with this exception is that it generally allows no sharing, or at best, in very limited circumstances, like in the German national transposition. Some commentators complain about this lawful access requirement. They underline the fact, they stress the fact that it may increase the subscription costs for research institutions, because now publishers know that it will automatically allow text and data mining. So they can use this argument to increase the cost of subscriptions. But on the other hand, this lawful access requirements actually preserves scientific publishers' business model, which I think personally is a reasonable compromise. The requirement of secure storage of the copies may have a chilling effect. That is, researchers may simply say, well, if I have to store the copies securely, is my storage secure? How secure? What are the security measures I have to implement? So I may decide on simply deleting the copies. I may not store them whatsoever. That might be simpler. And this, of course, can be very detrimental for open science. Also, the relation with technological protection measures, as I mentioned, is kind of unclear. So it's not entirely clear when right holders, publishers can apply technological protection measures to actually prevent text and data mining, because they can only do it to the extent necessary to provide to guarantee the security and stability of their networks and databases. And that is quite a broad definition, isn't it? Specifically, when it comes to open science, there is one point I worry about, is that this exception can really disincentivize data licensing and open sharing. We all know that real open science is only possible thanks to proper licensing of the data. This is actually reflected in one of the FAIR principles, the principle R1.1, is that fair data should be reusable, and in order to be reusable, they should be released with a clear and accessible data license. A license is nothing else than a permission from rights holders. So why would a researcher bother seeking permission from right holders if there is an exception? Or if the researcher is actually a researcher who produces the data, why would he bother licensing the data if, well, research institutions can use the data without a license? So it may have, in that sense, it may have a detrimental effect on open science, and open in the original sense of the word, that is available for anyone and for any purpose. Now, what are the solutions? I think that research institutions and research funding bodies have a huge role to play in adopting open access and open science mandates, that is, policies that oblige researchers to publish their data, papers, etc., under open science conditions, under proper licenses. And I also think that research infrastructures have a role to play in mitigating the problems with secure storage of the data, especially, and also to a limited extent with the sharing of the data. Thank you very much for your attention, and I am very much looking forward to any questions that you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Paweł. Yeah, it's a very interesting and also a very complex issue that we are dealing with. Before we begin, I'd like to also just remind everyone, please feel free to go ahead and put in your questions to our QR code, as well as to our Q&A function. And yeah, while we wait for that, I had a question to begin with. In preparing for this subject the other day, I came across a quote in an article, and I wanted to get your opinion on this. You had mentioned the difference between the EU and US model. And with the EU copyright and database rules, it had said that the US model was usually favored due to the flexibility of the fair use doctrine, as opposed to the EU-style closed system of exceptions and limitations. And I just wanted to get, just if we can, clear-cut your view on that. Would you agree on that? And if that's the case, what can we do to get the EU and the US models a little bit more parallel with each other?
Yes, I personally agree with this. I do think that the fair use model provides for greater flexibility. Text and data mining has been expressly allowed by US courts as fair use, simply, and even not carried out by research institutions, and even carried out for commercial purposes. Actually, Google Books, the Google Book Search functionality, has been expressly ruled as compliant with the fair use and the copyright framework. So it does prevent greater flexibility. In that sense, it's more time-proof. So it's easier to catch up with the technology with an open norm like that. However, my American friends would usually tell me, careful what you wish, because this flexible fair use approach actually produces quite a lot of legal uncertainty. If you have a narrowly defined exceptions, you have a checklist, what can be done, and it's easier to design your workflow in a way that fits with these exceptions. Whereas in fair use countries like in the United States, quite often we simply don't know until a court decides whether our use actually qualifies as fair or not, and that creates a lot of uncertainty. Can we converge? I think no. I think this ship has sailed. I think Europe has adopted this system of copyright exceptions more than 20 years ago, and I think it has become a part of our legal heritage, of our legal culture, and changing it would be a very profound modification, and it would require a lot of efforts, and it would simply politically be extremely difficult to do, I think. So it's not realistically possible, I think.
Yeah, fascinating. Thank you very much for your answer on that, for your opinion. Okay, let me continue with our participants. We have our first question here. It might be also blended at the same time. What is the practice of using the titles and abstracts of publications for the purpose of data mining and visualizations as part of a library or research institution, and the possibility of advancing that research to a production level non-commercial? Great question.
It is a complex question, and if I understood it correctly, I think, it's a pity I cannot exchange with the person who asked the question, but
let me jump in real quick, because we do have our speaker's corner coming up at 3:15 this afternoon.
Oh, really?
So for the person that asked that question, Paweł, you'll be around for that, right?
Yes, by all means. Yes.
You'll definitely have a chance to go into more detail just for the person that asked that. But if you want to give it a short try, go ahead.
Yes, a short answer. Yes, using abstracts and titles for text and data mining by researchers affiliated with a research institution definitely falls within the scope of the exception. So I think that such use is covered by the exception.
Great. Thank you very much. Our next question we have: do you differentiate between commercial and non-profit? Most research, even non-profit institutes, will always fall under commercial definition.
The law, when it comes to copyright law, at least, only distinguishes between commercial and non-commercial. And indeed, it is very hard to say what is non-commercial, because one can even argue that in capitalism, every human activity has a commercial aspect to it, because researchers are paid for doing their job. But, and so this non-commercial requirement was very heavily criticized, and it really wasn't clear what is and isn't commercial. My position has always been that research made by universities, research institutions, is by definition non-commercial, apart perhaps from public-private partnerships. And now the new exception actually clears it up. We know that First of all, the non-commercial requirement is gone when it comes to text and data mining. What really counts is the institution that the researcher is affiliated with. So it has to be a sort of a public research institution, like a university or a public research institute. On the other hand, public-private partnerships are expressly covered. Yes, I think short answer, bottom line, those of you who are affiliated with universities or research institutions in Europe really don't have to worry about the commercial or non-commercial nature of their activity anymore. And this is one of the achievements of the new exception.
Thank you. We have time real quick for one or two more questions. I have my next one here. It seems to be a bit unclear if the research output that emanates from TDM is copyright free. How can one be sure?
Very much so. Very much so. It's a central gray area in copyright law related to artificial intelligence. Most commentators tend to say that the output is not protected by copyright because it does not reproduce snippets of the original data. I'm in the natural language processing community, so to say. So then there are all sorts of language models, and there are different language models, but usually a language model would not reproduce long strings of text, reproduce individual words or very short strings, like 3 grams, the strings of three words, and not 11 grams, and not strings of 11 words, as decided by the Court of Justice of the European Union, that such strings can be protected by copyright. But it's an overgeneralization, it's an oversimplification. There can be all sorts of variety of, all sorts of outputs of the TDM process. Some of them can absolutely include copyright protected material, and then they, of course, sharing such outputs and using such outputs entail further copyright issues. But it is very much a gray area, I agree, but I think that it can be argued that in many cases, classic cases, the output of the TDM process will not be copyright protected because it does not reproduce excerpts from the original data set. But it really has to be decided on a case-by-case basis. This is why I put the question mark in my presentation.
Understood.
Thank you for spotting it. A very good remark.
Yeah, very good. We ran out of time, but I'm going to break the rules here. A quick question and a quick answer, if I can, Paweł. The last question, to sum up, no Pyrrhic victory for open science, ? TDM is especially hard for individual researchers. Real brief, your thoughts on that.
Yes, well, actually, individual researchers, if you mean citizen scientists, that is, researchers that are not affiliated with research institutions, indeed. Well, in Germany, thanks to this very liberal transposition of this exception, citizen scientists actually are covered by this exception. As far as I know, everywhere else in all the other member states that I know of, this is not the case, but still there is the general text and data mining exception. And let me very briefly tell you what the general text and data mining exception for the general public says. It allows text and data mining of content that the person has lawful access to. However, the right holders, the authors, can opt out from the system simply by implementing machine readable measures. That is, you can scrape, as a citizen scientist not covered by the special exceptions for research, you can scrape the internet, mine the internet, but you have to respect the robots.txt file that can contain this little command that will actually prohibit your crawler from copying this content. So it can be very easily reduced and opted out by right holders. And according to many commentators, it can be actually reduced to dead letter because it's so easy to opt out from it. bottom line, I agree. It is tough for individual researchers not affiliated with research institutions. And I'll be happy to discuss it further during the Q&A session, the Meet the Speaker session.
Excellent. Dr. Paweł Kamocki, I'd like to give you a round of applause.